Recently, I've been dipping in and out of this book, United States by Gore Vidal, because I figured, I'm making videos about books, I might as well. In this book of essays, some of which are more political, some are literary, I came across an essay on the Oz books, The Wizard of Oz. The author is L. Frank Baum, I think. So I've seen like the movie The Wizard of Oz. That's my exposure. I haven't read the Oz books, but this is like a long essay. And he cites one interesting reading of the Oz books. Harry Littlefield demonstrates in American Quarterly, 1964, that the book The Wizard of Oz is a parable on populism, in which the Tin Woodman is seen as the Eastern individualist worker. He is discovered by Dorothy in the eastern land of the Munchkins. The Scarecrow as the farmer, and the Lion as the politician, William Jennings Bryan, who as a group approach the wizard, McKinley, to ask for relief from their sufferings. Dorothy's magical silver shoes, the proposed silver standard, traveling along the yellow brick road, gold, are lost forever in the deadly desert when she returns to Kansas when Bryan lost the election. Gore Vidal comments dryly, "This is certainly elaborate." End quote. If you read Gore Vidal and you understand what he's doing, I think it's obvious that for him and for the readers, there's this understanding that narrow political reading of The Wizard of Oz is absurd. It is extremely reductionist and extremely limited and limiting. Gore Vidal engages with books in a way which is rich. He's interested in books as artifacts of communication and aesthetic artifacts, powerful vehicles for something, for art, whatever that means, whatever that can do. But they're not these coded communications about some political election from the 50s. And so where do we draw the line? How do we determine what's a good reading, what's a bad reading? What's the use of symbols in literature? And these questions came to me when I saw a video put out by the Codex Cantina, the guys, Una and Crypto, a great channel, which I enjoy immensely. And they put out a video today on a short story called, I think it's The Man Who Was Almost a Man by Richard Wright. And they engage with this question, what does a gun represent? And they seem to be framing it as, what does a gun represent in literature? And I would push back on that reading, because who says that the gun has to represent anything? Who says that guns represent anything in literature? What does anything represent in literature? This question of how to interpret symbols, how to use symbols, comes up a lot in this online community of BookTube, people who make videos about books. And part of the joy of being a part of this community is being able to hear different voices and opinions and perspectives on how to properly read books and interpret symbols. What comes to mind is a video on Lolita. I won't say who made this video. It's an older video, has thousands of views. And one of the analyses done in the video is that part 1 of Lolita has 33 chapters, and Jesus was 33 years old when he was crucified. And I love Lolita. It's literally one of my favorite books of all time. I read a lot of Vladimir Nabokov. I read a lot of his writings. I've read his essays and some of his lectures. I've read a lot about his writings. I've read interviews with Vladimir Nabokov. I feel very confident in saying that Vladimir Nabokov does not play games with chapter numbers where he's like trying to get the right number of chapters because it's like a reference to Jesus's crucifixion. I feel very confident about that. Vladimir Nabokov is operating on the plane of aesthetics, on the plane of something transformative, affecting in a emotional, spiritual level. And to do numerology, like count every other letter in each other chapter and try to construct some sort of hidden message, to me is a huge misreading. And it speaks to a kind of like elitism, because it creates this dynamic where you get it or you don't get it. Like there's like privileged information. Like, do you know the symbols? Do you know the correct reading? There is, of course, some place for symbols. And I think arguably the reading that the Codex Cantina guys do is actually very compelling in this case. But why? What is that reading? I mean, symbols can mean things to people. As human beings, we inhabit a world of symbols. And as human beings, physical objects can carry all sorts of connotations and meanings. And so, a very important question to ask in the story, The Man Who Was Almost a Man, is what does a gun represent to the protagonist of that story who wants to acquire a gun? That's a very meaningful question. One of the most formative reading experiences in my life was in college, where I took a course with a great professor, an Argentinian woman, and she was teaching South American literature. And we read a short story by Julio Cortázar called House Taken Over. And I absolutely loved this story, and I still do. I've reread it multiple times, and I think about it a lot. It's a story that really stayed with me. In the story, we get sort of like this brother and sister, and they like share a bed together in this large mansion. And basically, towards the middle of the story, one of the like climactic moments, I won't tell anything beyond the middle of the stories. They hear a sound in the house and they like panic, and it results in them like shutting off half of the house and never going there and saying that side of the house is taken over. Unlike other stories that we read in that same class with that same teacher, there was not a whole lot of discussion around this story. She didn't encourage a lot of analysis and different ideas. And she told us very emphatically that this is a metaphor for Peronism, the way in which Argentina sort of fell to a repressive, autocratic, dictatorial leader in Perón. And that was sort of like the end of the discussion in that class about the story. And at the time, I remember having such a strong stand, such a strong position develop in my mind. And I felt so strongly that this is backwards. This is incorrect. For this particular teacher, she appreciates this story on the level of a kind of metaphor for a traumatic political event that happened in her country. And no doubt, the author of the story has said, or has implied perhaps, that this story can be read as a metaphor for political events in Argentina. But I claim, in my opinion, the only reason it makes any sense to talk about House Taken Over as a political metaphor is because first and foremost, it works on the level of literature. It works on the level of themes and characters and human psychology, and it says something that resonates in a universal way. For it to be useful as that metaphor, it has to first stand on its own feet as a work of art. One person who was practically obsessed with symbols is Sigmund Freud, who saw all sorts of symbols in people's dreams, and he brought a whole economy of symbols to bear in his psychoanalytic work that he pioneered. And the chapter in the book The Violet Hour by Katie Roiphe about the death of Freud is one of my favorite chapters in this book, and it has stayed with me for a long time. She tells the story of how Freud died, and he died of like a kind of terrible mouth cancer that was like eating away at his mouth and his face. And I think she describes he had like a gaping hole at one point. And all throughout, Freud continued to smoke cigars, and he smoked cigars with abandon. And Freud knew, and his doctors certainly knew, that these were really bad for his condition, and they were making his condition much, much, much worse, and making his prognosis much worse. But Freud continued. He persisted in his smoking. And she dedicates a significant amount of words to thinking about that and trying to understand that. And this is how she sort of ends that section. Quote, "On the whole, and apart from these occasional allusions, Freud resisted any sustained analysis of his cigar smoking. It was somehow off limits, separate from the analyzable world. He analyzed himself extensively in The Interpretation of Dreams and elsewhere, but he did not analyze his relation to smoking, complex and impassioned as it obviously was. He did not discuss his continued commitment to smoking even in the face of illness and the explicit prohibitions of doctor after doctor. He seemed to be living the idea that sometimes a cigar is just a cigar." End quote. And that's, of course, a famous quote attributed to Freud. And she now Roife picks up on the fact that it's unclear whether or not Freud actually said that quote, "Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar." She continues, "There is some question about whether Freud actually ever made this legendary comment in a speech he gave to students at Clark University in 1909. He did, however, carve off cigars as a private matter, something to be kept apart from the interpretive digging of his method. In a letter to Ernest Jones, 'If someone should reproach you with my fall into sin, you are free to reply that my adherence to telepathy is my private affair, like my Jewishness, my passion for smoking, and inessential for psychoanalysis. Smoking, then, is in a special separate category. He does not want it to be analyzed. It is something he does beyond analysis. It is his own mystery.'"